All right. So I think I will actually do the job of welcoming us all here now. It's wonderful to see all of your faces popping up and all of you joining us from the different places around the world that you're coming from today. So good evening, good afternoon. I'm wondering if for some of you it might be good morning yet still, depending on where you are. So, and I think what I'm seeing here to tie it in already to Mark's project are the webs of relationships that we are enacting here, that Mark's book is already a part of within different scholarly circles, different schools of worship creation. And so it's exciting to see that made present just here in this moment on Zoom. So let's see, a few things to share with you. My name is Nekola. I will be our host for this event, which means I'm mainly going to be turning over the microphone to other voices here today. I'll get started with what I found to be the most fun, which is coming up with introductions for all of you. So starting with Mark. Mark is an accomplished scholar in Christian congregational music. In his publications and in conversations like today's, Mark is able to converse with folks from a broad range of interests and backgrounds and perspectives, not only within formal academic music studies, but beyond. Mark's interests within Christian music studies are expansive. From the contemporary music, sometimes with the work he's done on music with organizations like Hillsong, to, as maybe we will talk about a little bit today, the soundscapes of the Desert Fathers. Mark's first book, Contemporary Worship and Everyday Musical Lives, is an ethnomusicological study of the dynamic among worship leaders, congregations, and church leadership in several UK congregations, and it focuses on how individuals negotiate the intersections of their everyday musical lives with their experiences of attending organized worship services. Mark focuses on tensions around belonging and argues for bringing a musical ethical perspective to our analyses and conversations about worship practices. Mark is having quite an exciting publishing year. The collection he co-edited with Nate Myrick of Mercer University, called Ethics and Christian Musicking, will be coming out in 2021 as a volume in the Congregational Music Studies series at Routledge. Mark has been working as a postdoctoral researcher at the Max Weber Center for Advanced Cultural and Sociological Research at the University of Erfurt. And I understand that this is a place, a very fruitful place for exploring many of these issues that are a part of this book that we're here today to celebrate, Ecologies of Resonance in Christian Musicking. Mark is also an organist and a flautist who enjoys a fine pot of tea. Our other speakers today, Dr. Monique Ingalls is an associate professor at Baylor University in Texas, where she is also the graduate program director in church music studies. Along with Mark and Martyn Percy, Monique was one of the founders of the Christian Congregational Music Local and Global Perspectives Conference that meets at Ripon College, Cuddesdon in odd-numbered years. Some of you here may be familiar with the conference. I know some of you I've seen at previous conferences. And we will be hosting the 10th anniversary meeting this coming summer. And I note that the call for papers is currently open. We hope you can join us. Monique also investigates the relationship of music and community. Her book, Singing the Congregation, How Contemporary Worship Music Forms Evangelical Community, came out with Oxford in 2018, and she's currently in the midst of research with Black British gospel communities in the UK. Jonathan Dueck is Vice President Academic and Academic Dean and Associate Professor of Ethnomusicology at Canadian Mennonite University in Winnipeg, Manitoba in Canada. He is the co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Music and World Christianities, which in 2018 received the honorable mention for the Ellen Koskoff Edited Volume Prize from the Society of Ethnomusicology. When not working on developing university writing programs, John has been training his new puppy and working on a book about sound and sport. And lastly, the very Reverend Professor Martyn Percy is the Dean of Christ Church at Oxford University. I first met Martyn when he was the principal of Ripon College, Cuddesdon, a theological training college for the Church of England. Martyn is an engaging speaker, a dedicated teacher, and a prolific writer. As a theologian, Martyn's work engages Anglicanism as well as new Christian movements, as well and including the dynamic between Christianity and contemporary culture. His specializations are contemporary ecclesiology, as well as practical, pastoral, and contextual theology. The last time I saw Martyn in person, he also had a new canine friend, Lyra, I remember, and so perhaps he and John can trade puppy training stories later today. So, and Monique, I think, is a cat person, so just getting that all out here. And with this, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Mark Porter to tell us about his new book.
Perfect. So it's my task now to introduce the book and describe a little bit about what I'm trying to accomplish with it and where it came from. I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes or so, and then we're going to have a couple of different responses to the book from the other panelists. And to grasp what something's about, it's often easiest to start with a story or with an example. And I'm going to begin by reading a brief excerpt from the beginning of chapter 4 in the volume. As the clock approaches 10:30, members of the worship band emerge from the congregation and make their way onto the stage. They approach instruments and microphones connected via XLR cables through a stage box to a digital mixing desk at the back of the room. The desk, in turn, feeds its output through a series of amplifiers and delays in the neighboring power room to sets of speakers arranged around the pillars of the church building, to larger units attached to the ceiling, subwoofers concealed under the stage, and foldback speakers directed back at the band. The drummer clicks in, and bass, keyboard, guitar, and drums begin an opening chord sequence for the first song, locking into a groove as the musicians achieve to each other's patterns. As sound fills the internal space of the building, individual conversations come to an end, and the congregation ready themselves to share in an act of sung worship. The worship leader begins to sing. The sounding of the band in the space of the church provides a sonic environment into which he can express his deeply felt act of personal devotion. The sound of his voice, empowered by the room's technological apparatus, is able to fill a space far larger than the internal thought cycles and prayers that have been circling around his head during his mental preparations for the event. As the congregation find themselves enveloped in the sound of his worship, they begin to stir themselves to participate in this act, motivating themselves to feel what the words are telling them they feel, and with growing conviction, singing out their own sound into the room. While each individual voice is audible for only a couple of feet beyond the individual singing, many of those there at some point feel that through their singing, the space of the church and the heavenly space that lies beyond it is being filled with the sound of their worship and their inner love for and admiration of the God they worship. As they sing, members of the congregation in turn feel the sound attempting to solicit the feelings of their bodies, returning and resounding both in external space and inside individuals, from worship leader to speakers, to them, to the space of the church, back to the leaders on the stage, with acts of devotion producing a mutually reinforcing cycle as each element in turn re-empowers the others around it to sound with their own expression. As anyone who moves between different musical environments is well aware, different kinds of musical activity are able to offer a wide range of different experiences. And we often navigate between these, both within our own musical lives and in the way we position ourselves in relation to groups who do things differently. A big part of what serves to differentiate between different traditions of musical activity and devotional musical activity in particular, I want to suggest, comes down to the different kinds of world relation and interaction that music is able to offer in different environments. The example which I just described offers one possibility of the kinds of interactions that individuals experience in musical activity. And it's one that some will easily relate to, whilst other people will find highly problematic. This book is an attempt to develop a theory of the different relationships between people, spaces, and things which are set up in different traditions of Christian musical activity. And I use it this theory to explore a series of 5 different case studies, each of which offers a very different dynamic of interaction. Some of them are my own rereadings of familiar historical situations, and others have involved fresh fieldwork. It's an attempt to think ecumenically and to think about diverse situations alongside one another through a common lens. In doing that, it should be thought of as a project which attempts to find a potential route for greater mutual understanding across traditional boundaries. The title of the book doesn't necessarily offer a particularly clear idea of what I'm doing. It's written more to intrigue than to offer a complete picture of the book. And so I want to unpack these 3 key words in the title. When I first came across it, the idea of resonance captured my imagination as something which had the potential to grapple with some of the issues I just described. The word means vastly different things to different people. And the basic idea that grounds my understanding is that sound is something which resounds. It bounces back and forth. It expands into different spaces. It vibrates within bodies and instruments in the room. And in doing so, it sets up complexes of back and forth relationships and interactions. I hear the sound of a musical leader that resounds in my ear or my body. I then produce my own sound alongside it, which in turn spreads out in the space of the room. And this can often be highly desirable, something that people strive for, but not always. Whilst it begins in physical sonic interaction, this is something that takes place on far more than a physical level. Rather, the physical interactions of sound afford different relationships on a social level, on a spiritual level, and other levels alongside those. As sound travels back and forth, it carries alongside other dimensions with it. One of the obvious examples is the idea that when I'm singing, I'm expressing some of my feelings out into the room, and the sound carries those with them. Or the idea, of course, that something sacred is encountered through music, however cliched that idea may be. Ecologies. So this is about the idea that different kinds of musical environments are made up of different sets of these interactions. And whilst it's a word that often is used to describe the natural world and natural environments, it has much broader applicability. It refers to broader systems of dependencies, interactions, and activities that take place within wider systems of engagement. When I engage in musical activity, I'm caught up in a network of interactions which are essential to what that activity is, and then not simply some kind of side effect. And finally, musicking, which is a word that musicologists will be more than familiar with, but others outside of musicology may find odd. For me, this is a term that has become an ever more natural part of my talk about music. It's introduced famously by Christopher Small, and it's simply the use of music the use of the word music as a verb rather than a noun to describe it as an activity, but again, one that highlights the range of people that can take place within that activity. So this book uses these basic ideas to ask different questions of devotional music. In a devotional musical environment, what interplays with what? Which subjects, objects, things, quasi-things, spaces, or aggregations of these interact in musical activity? What dimensions of resonance are brought into play within a particular situation? A sound, sense, vibration, divine presence, meaning, all carried along together. How do these interrelate? What different lines of travel can we trace back and forth between different entities and through different media? How are things and relationships changed in this process? How does sonic interaction affect our relationship to space? Is any of this desirable, positive, or good? It's easiest to grasp what this means through a brief description of the case studies. And so I want to give an overview very quickly of the 5 different chapters here. I begin the first chapter by attempting to strip things down to the most basic form imaginable, to a single person sitting in a cell in the middle of a desert, making music or sound. What happens when we think of that simplest of all situations? In this particular chapter, I'm exploring it through the writings of the Desert Fathers and their imagination of sound and music and aesthetic discipline. And I trace the different interactions that sound and singing set up between landscape, body, architecture, and the surrounding spiritual world that includes both demonic powers and divine activity. Bach. I wrote most of this book while I was in Erfurt, one of Bach's, one of the places where he traveled and played whilst he was in Thüringen. And this chapter takes as its starting provocation Tanya Kevorkian's idea that congregations in Bach's time were very noisy spaces, and that Bach cantata and passion performances would have taken place in very noisy conversation environments. So it's a move towards looking at the social dimensions that this conversation opens up. And the idea is to take that noisy interaction, not simply as a distraction from activity of paying attention to whatever great things Bach may have produced, but as an interactional ecology which profoundly affects the meaning of the music and the way we understand the contingency of meaning within these musical worlds and the integration of music into broader social setups. Evangelicals, authenticity and sacrament. Describing evangelical worship music, sacrament and authenticity are increasingly common descriptions, so much so that I became somewhat bored of them and wanted to develop some new terminology, which is partly why I moved to Resonance. But this is an attempt to talk about these terms alongside each other, to talk about them both outward authentic expression and inward sacramental reception as part of a broader complex of back and forth interactions that are constantly evolving and shifting, which have changed a great deal over the course of contemporary worship music history. Emerging churches. Fairly little has been written about music in the emerging church movement. A set of sort of postmodern deconstructive church congregations which come up with often highly idiosyncratic ritual practices as part of their attempts to renew their faith in a way that makes sense, often in a post-evangelical space. This involved a fair amount of fieldwork with different emerging church groups. And this chapter describes the movement that takes place from a group dynamic within evangelical worship to one in which music is offered as something which provides room and space, and in which ambient textures form part of the devotional environment. And finally, the last chapter looks at prayer room live streaming and transnational resonant assemblages. So I wrote this before the pandemic and before live streaming had become such a relevant topic, but this is looking at 24/7 prayer room environments which use a continuous stream of music and sound within them, but which stream that to other prayer room spaces, into other people's houses, into wherever other people are wanting to hook into what's happening in those environments. And I develop an understanding of those through words like agreement, affordance, assemblage, atmosphere. I'm looking at contingent interplays between spaces. And the word assemblage is designed to point to precisely to that sense of contingency, to the idea that there's no inherent logic here of one way that things have to be put together, but the different things are constantly coming together in different ways, depending on the ways which different people, groups use them and the different spaces within which they're deployed. So where does all this lead? I'm not going to describe all my conclusions in detail. I hope it points to a way of understanding the diversity of Christian musical practices, which offers something different from traditional histories or taxonomies. I hope it offers a way of putting human experience and interaction at the heart of our understanding of these musical traditions. It's an ecumenical project, but one which doesn't seek to collapse the boundaries between different traditions, but rather to offer a portrait which translates them all into a common theoretical language. And the ultimate picture I present is a highly dynamic one. And I'm very much drawn to the idea of these different devotional traditions as forming a sort of rhizomatic network with lines of flight constantly opening up from each tradition into other environments which offer fresh modes of being and fresh modes of devotion.
Thank you, Mark. I just want to say, as someone who often has people asking me, okay, can you sum that down to a really tight summary? That was an outstanding summary of your book, I think. I'm going to turn it over first to Monique Ingalls, who's going to give us some of her thoughts on this great book.
Can you hear me? All right, excellent. Well, I want to begin by first saying thank you to Mark, first off, for the immense service that he's done to us, for us all, by writing this book, and also for inviting me to this transnational gathering today to comment on it. So over the next couple of minutes, I'm going to draw attention to three contributions in particular: an expansion of our conceptual vocabulary, the book's focus on questions, and then the resonant writing involved. So first, I appreciated the book's keen attention to fine-tuning the conceptual vocabulary for Christian music making. I think that we are all here because we believe that the words and categories we use to describe Christian music making matter. They matter for understanding and they matter for practice. And remarkably, a slippery, somewhat fuzzy term like resonance, Mark convinced me, is in some ways more precise than existing terms used to talk about the same things. The book offers a very clear explanation of what's involved in an ecological approach to musical activity. And Mark has spoken about that some, but I want to speak about it a bit more. I'll confess that this is a conversation within music studies that I've been on the edge of for a while, not quite grasping the difference or the significance from previous ways of thinking. But thanks to Mark's work in this book, it's finally sunk in, and now I'm an enthusiastic convert to this way of understanding music and to its significance to congregational music making. And my evangelism for this approach will start in a seminar next semester. So Baylor graduate students, be ready. By privileging the environment of music making as an actor within the interaction, ecology becomes, I think, a superior term to use in that of context. Ecology foregrounds and then steps around two unhelpful tendencies in how I see, in my own research and teaching, how context is often applied. The first is the idea that context is static, that it's inert or impassible, and that it doesn't shift based on what takes place within it. And the second tendency, rather the opposite, is to see the environment as something that more or less determines the action that happens inside of it. So calling something a context can create a false division between the subject or object in question and their surroundings, whereas environment stresses the relationship between those things. Secondly, I also appreciated the book's emphasis on questions. This isn't and doesn't attempt to be a magisterial volume that claims to have all the answers or to set forth the model that will explain everything or that we can fit all Christian music making into a nice tidy box. Instead, every part of it is infused with an honest sense of inquiry. In writings about Christian music, there is a tendency for various sorts of ideological orthodoxies to creep in and to shut down rather than to open up the possibility for questions. And I'm thinking here of work intended for Christian and, quote, secular audiences alike. But the questions in this book proceed from a curiosity and an openness. an openness to seeing new patterns, and also an openness to finding insights that might cause one to have to rethink deeply held and deeply felt truths about music and the world. This book is refreshing because it shows us that there are so many things to be curious about, whether those occur along well-worn paths like J.S. Bach's music or in new frontiers like 24/7 prayer rooms. In the introduction, the book sets out 9 questions that can be asked with, or 9 kind of sets of questions that can be asked with resonance as a guiding concept. Though these questions are, of course, being asked as part of a highly sophisticated theoretical apparatus, what struck me when first reading this was their pragmatic value. As an advisor of graduate work in church music and congregational music studies, I am always on the lookout for sources that will help students with research design. We talk a lot about posing research questions with responses that are pertinent and significant to dialogue partners across fields. And this long list of questions at the beginning that Mark then returns to in the conclusion struck me as a goldmine for excellent questions that can be applied to so many different aspects of congregational music making. So if you're here today and you're a postgraduate student and having a hard time coming up with a thesis idea, buy this book and borrow one or more of the questions that it asks. The last point that I want to make relates to the resonant writing in this book. One of the joys of reading it is that the writing models the theoretical idea of resonance that it's developing. One rhetorical strategy for conveying this sense of resonance that I really appreciated were the personal vignettes that opened up each of the chapters. These, Mark read one of these, the one beginning in chapter 4, but all of them, they serve to ground the questions being posed directly in the experience, in the body of the author. Resonance isn't something that is being observed and measured by a godlike figure outside the process. Rather, these assemblages implicate and move through the author himself. Knowing that the author has experienced and experimented with the different resonant practices he's describing is something that I think a religious scholarly audience will find especially beneficial. And the writing offers multiple opportunities for the ideas to resonate within the reader as well. So in rereading this book to prepare my comments for today, there was one chapter that resonated more strongly with me in my role as a church musician and leader during this particular historical moment. So chapter 3 is the one that discusses patterns of resonance within noisy congregations and argues that the dynamics of 17th century German Lutheran congregations must be taken seriously to fully understand and interpret Bach's music. And I found many of the discussions in this chapter profoundly relevant in helping to frame some of the discussions that churches are facing regarding their musical and sonic architecture. So let's go back a few months to pre-pandemic times. Many churches that I know of in the US, in the United Kingdom, and probably elsewhere as well, struggle with what to do with certain kinds of noises in their worship services. I'm thinking particularly here of the noises of children. About every 4 or 5 years, there's a small upswell in discourse around whether or whether not to have children in the main Sunday worship service, and it revolves in great part around noise. The separationists argue that kids' noises are a distraction to adult worshipers and they need to be sent to their own service that's more developmentally appropriate, while the integrationists argue back that children's noises are a welcome sign of an intergenerational community worshiping together that must be accommodated. So in churches like my own, a small Episcopal congregation in Waco, Texas, the services aren't so much divided by categories like traditional and contemporary, so much as they are divided by, shall we say, low noise and high noise. You want to worship in more or less complete silence, you go to the 8 a.m. service. If you have young kids and or are tolerant or welcoming of a bit higher noise to signal ratio, then you'll go to 10:30. And as the parent of a 3-year-old and an almost 5-year-old, you can guess which service I'm going to be attending. But with the move to live streaming in the pandemic, I find our later service has become much like the former. With the hi-fi live stream, the noisy distractions are removed from the broadcast, but the signal then has to contend with a new noise of home activities. So, all of this, just thinking of this through Mark's categories, so in our own live streamed, personal ecologies, while I'm watching live stream church, I now have to contend with music coming from the TV in the other room, my girls' umpteenth viewing of Frozen 2. But I didn't realize how much I was missing the church noise of other people's children until a video recorded offertory song that aired about a month ago. So in this offertory, pre-recorded on a mobile phone and aired during a live stream Sunday service, one of our congregants sang "Down to the River to Pray" a cappella. As she's singing it, she's swaying gently while holding her 6-month-old little girl, who lets out an occasional happy coo. We can hear the two other children making mostly happy noises in the background. In our socially distanced environment, the song was all the more moving because of the noise from the children, not in spite of it. Their noise signifies our relationships with others in the church. And that's so much of what Mark's chapter, was getting at. And so, kind of from a pragmatic perspective, it's gotten me thinking, how can we incorporate more noise into our pandemic worship service? There are also a number of implications for music teaching, but I'll save some of those for the Q&A. Thank you again for the opportunity to contribute.
Thank you, Monique. I'm going to pass the virtual microphone to Jonathan Dueck.
So thank you, Mark, for bringing us together across 3 universities and 3 countries and many networks of friends here. Your writing is special. You're a special person. I wanted to tell you here too. I vividly remember Mark walking us through the streets of Oxford, holding a tiny umbrella. And being able to see him in each place and his telling of the lore of this place that he loved. And so this kind of traversal of space, the book, that's one of the pleasures of this book, is just to get a sense of Mark. Mark's voice and Mark's personality comes through so clearly in this book, and it's special, and it links many of us here. So here I see us all as offering our readings of Mark's book, and especially what we think is new and useful in it. So let me start with what I think is in there. And some of this, I'm going to repeat. 75 of these words are repeats. As an inveterate reviser, I'm using 75 of these words that I wrote for the dust cover of Mark's book, and trying to tell you what I think they actually mean. So here, Mark Porter's book explores the dynamics of interaction and sound across a dizzying variety of Christian devotional settings and moments. Porter's core idea of resonance, rather than giving answers, opens up new questions for us. Here I should add, Porter is particularly drawing on sociologist Hartmut Rosa's theoretical work when using the term, and he defines this in such a lovely way. He offers this wonderfully expansive framing of Hartmut Rosa's idea of resonance when he notes that resonance is a kind of call and response moment where one calls the universe and the universe answers back. Porter helps us ask why and how patterned sound is present across varieties of religious devotion, and also what qualities of devotion particular patterns of sound and interaction allow for. This is the idea of affordances that runs through Mark's book. So here, and this is a subset of the work in the book. I think Porter is working maybe more with sound studies than with ethnomusicology writ large as his dialogue partner. You draw in Veit Earlman, and I think there's more to be done here. But for me, I want to point to predecessors of Earlman, especially Steve Feld and earlier Charles Seeger, who had this truly ecological and cosmological understanding of patterned sound that I see reflected in Mark's writing here. Because sound moves between all the bodies in a space, and it permeates them, moves out of the space and into the eddies in the air beyond. It seems to instantiate, to make tangible the spiritual connections that bridge us and that bridge all things. Right? And it confounds the distinction between signal and noise in the way that Monique has talked about. I remember Steve Feld talking about a recording where people started to record not only the shepherds, these Mediterranean shepherds who sang this song, but also the sheep who wear bells. And suddenly, oh, this is why the songs sound like this, because the sheep are partners in making this music. So for those reasons, and reading Mark's book in light of that longer discussion within ethnomusicology that presages sound studies and becomes it, I particularly love the chapter that imagines sound and resonance with the Desert Fathers texts in mind. Mark describes the cells and the ways sound and silence are part of the monk's world in ways that are both sensory and spiritual. And you reminded me of, of really diverse things here of Foucault, where Foucault talks about the cells that structure monastic life and that give you that make space and time related to one another in a structured manner, and of Stephen Helmreich, who's an anthropologist who writes about transduction. Sound moves in between spaces and is transformed when it moves through those substances between them. So moving inward, Mark draws out understandings of the monk's own body as emptied, as a resonant chamber. And sound here appears as a patterning that can link the immediate and the cosmic in ways that remind me of these sound studies imaginations of sound, these very contemporary, in some ways, anthropological imaginations of sound, but rooted authentically in these ancient texts. Moving outward and mindful of the ways that sound can permeate bodies as well as spaces, Mark talks about demons and the disordered kinds of music and pattern sound that they produce in these ancient texts. That music damages because it disconnects. It does not save. It kills. You know, it's a handy inversion of what Bob Marley once said about good music. Music is the biggest gun. It doesn't kill, it saves. But that's the opposite in the music of demons here. And here we see the value of the distance at which Porter holds resonance as a concept. Resonance here is a very helpful lens because its logic appears. Its logic appears in the prayers and accounts of these ancient texts in ways that map back onto the contemporary concept. Resonance isn't a grand theory. Here I'm agreeing with Monique. It isn't a grand theory that's imposed, but it's a sensitizing concept, or maybe a sensorizing concept that helps provide a gathering place for a lot of different Christian musical experiences. Okay, so what are the larger discussions here? What is new? For me as a reader, I see Mark working here and elsewhere toward a rapprochement between theology and music. And here I want to give a shout out to Zoe Serenian, who's here too, and who's done, I think, some really interesting pioneering work in this regard. The way I see Mark doing this, I think about the rapprochement between theology and music studies is especially with regards to music studies understood in the wholehearted sense of Musikwissenschaft, right? Or in anthropological sound studies and ethnomusicology. You know, a capacious understanding of music. In church music studies, we often write in ways that are not terribly theological, or if we write in theological ways, we do so in a potentially reductive mode in which we read music as a theological text that establishes its propositions or maybe open up some new proposition. But those of us who sing together in church we know that music is not a text or not only a text. It is an occasion, it is a practice, it is an experience, it is an instantiation of something more. It is dance, it is athleticism, it is movement, it is breathing, it is being together. It changes us. So a push towards thinking theologically and musically at once and taking music in its wholeness seriously makes me think of Baroque music theory, like Werkmeister. Here I'm thinking of my colleague Dietrich Bartel's work on Werkmeister, where pattern, sound, and theology are inseparable. How can one account for the effects of music like Bach's without a numinous cosmology, and one that has a kind of order, a patterning, an order that is relational, that connects things? Theology in that kind of period of music theory is present as the queen of the sciences, just as part of knowledge, not as a fully separable discipline. And I'm also thinking of contemporary work by theologians who are especially influenced by and engaged with anthropology. People like my colleague Gord Zerby here at CMU, or Todd Whitmore of the University of Notre Dame, or William Cavanaugh. Are really interesting examples of this. And there we see both the material and the numinous as sources and evidence, and the theoretical sources are both anthropological and theological. But at least my work on church music is more anthropological than it is theological in a genuine sense. I mean, theological work appears, and I care about it. I've been trying to work on this for some time. But I think mostly I treat theology as a kind of example of the culture. I look at it as a source, as something to interpret that helps me see how church works culturally. I think that's true of a lot of work by my colleagues who are ethnomusicologists working on church and congregational music. And I think the work people are doing in this vein is excellent and generative work. But Mark's work here is different, and it begins to push us more towards a genuine engagement with theology in its role as the queen of the sciences. So I look forward to more of this, and I look forward to the rest of our discussion today. Thank you again for gathering us, Mark.
Thank you, John. And now we'd like to hear from Martyn.
Thank you very much indeed, Anna. And Mark, huge congratulations and thanks to you for this book, which we have hugely enjoyed. It's a real feast, actually. Wonderful stuff. I'd like to just draw attention to a number of things which I think are useful in discussion. I think the first thing to say is that I love the motif of ecology and rhizome, the idea that actually somehow there's a kind of self-perpetuating root in all of this that's actually growing through the groundedness of where worship takes place. And I particularly enjoyed the attention to the environment, which I know interests us all really, but I think you've given that a particularly interesting spatial and sensual attention, which is actually quite remarkable, really. I think where the book is very strong is that you invite us to contemplate the different environments in which worship takes place. Anthropologists, contextual theologians, sometimes practical theologians talk about ethos. They talk about mood. I think of the anthropologist Clifford Geertz, who talks about paying attention to mood in religion. And I also think of that extraordinary interview given by John Caputo about 10 years ago, when he describes religion in this very, very elegant sentence. Religion is the faithful attempting to capture or express the mood of God. And it's not here that God is moody, or has moods, or is emotionally unstable. It's that actually religion very often expresses what people think is the emotional repertoire that is emanating from the divine and is somehow being captured in ecclesiology, or in doctrine, or in dress codes, or in music, or in other aesthetics, which are often not attended to. In my own work, I've done recently some work on the use of smell and taste in worship, and how those things send specific signals to people about whether worship is fresh and relevant, or stale, or ancient, or modern, or contemporary. And you don't have to travel very far in the religious world to know that these things are very, very easily translate into music and singing and worship. One thing that interests me in this is the whole business of what we might call, if you're working with ecologies and rhizomes, is what we might call it, I'm here pushing your analogy here, is the whole messy business of transfer DNA. I don't really watch CSI and I don't really know enough about it, but what I do know is that some things are transferred and they somehow embed themselves, and other things do not. So I'm really interested, for example, in a brief episode in praise worship record albums, if you remember vinyls going back into the 1980s, when there was just an absolutely insatiable desire for people to purchase live worship, including, if they could, with glossolalia. And the fact of the matter is that the major record producers of Christian praise music did not have enough of these records to satisfy demand. So they dubbed praise and clapping and applause onto pre-recorded things to create the sense of things being live. And of course, the thing felt, I'm bound to say, unpleasantly plastic and rather false, because of course people listening to this knew that this had not really happened. And something about the authenticity of this was lost. It didn't last very long, this experiment, 2 or 3 years at most, but I'm really interested that actually this happened, but it didn't work for its mostly sort of consumer audience. I'm interested too as well that for myself, when I go to exuberant praise services with guitars and drums, they're incredibly captivating. I do find them very moving. It's not my usual repertoire, but I'm very persuaded when I go to these things that they are authentic, they're earthed, and so forth. When I hear these things transferred into the space of a cathedral, or for that matter onto Radio 4, for the morning worship service, it frankly doesn't work. There's something that's completely lost in translation. So how you move the resonance from one fora to another strikes me as being something that's well worth attending to. I've been known to remark that sometimes listening to praise music on Radio 4 is a bit like listening to Teletubbies on helium. It just sounds far too high-pitched, and it breaks away from that sort of slightly bassy, mellifluous Radio 4 dark chocolatey voice that some of us speak with all the time, like myself included, of course. It seems to me that one of the things that is really strong in this book is you're asking us to pay attention to the theological value and merit of mood and ethos and environment. And this is classic anthropological territory. And you've given this real theological currency and thought. It's absolutely brilliant. And to paraphrase what you've done, you've given us an exploration of human experience during the act of worship through these sonic patterns in sacred music and sound. And they, of course, reverberate through us. I think of that extraordinary Persian poet from the 13th century who says in one of those beautiful poems, I am but a flute for Christ, just a broken flute, but if you blow through me, I will make a noise. That sense of the actor being the agent of some kind of divine wind. So how sound and space shapes our social life and worship. And you've talked about personal, social, and spiritual realities through the conceptual lens of resonance. And that really enables us, I think, to have what, again, Clifford Geertz describes as a thick description of what is going on in worship. So not just musicology, not just ethnography, not just anthropology, but a proper thick description of what it's like to be in worship, experience it, and comprehend it. So thank you very, very much indeed. Thank you.